That's a good thing, because I don't think we would be able to fit everybody. So thank you for coming out. Just wanted to start with a couple line items that we have to check off here. If you didn't already know, there are some co-ed restrooms just right across the hall here. Otherwise, there's a men's restroom all the way around on the other side of the elevators, and a female restroom just right down the hall here. So feel free to walk out and do that if you need to, of course. Food and drink over here, I assume you already saw that, but moving on, just want to really thank you guys for all coming out. We appreciate it, and a huge thanks to our sponsors, K1 and Granicus tonight, sponsoring the event and allowing us to be here and Turing as well. We wouldn't be able to do this here without Turing, so huge thanks to them. And yeah, we've got a big night planned, a lot of browser knowledge, which I'm sure will serve us all well. So our first talk is How Browsers Get Data by Chandler Prall, and our second talk is all about offline in the browser by Chris Boland. So super pumped to have them both here, and with that, let's hand it off to Chandler. If you would, please give him a round of applause.
Hey, that works. Neat. Yeah, I think the main kind of theme of tonight is going to be technology working by magic, and that's so always nice when an audio system actually works. Cool. Yeah. My name is Chandler Prall. I'm one of the front-end developers over at Craftsy, doing lots of React development, isomorphic, so we run our applications on the Node server as well for server-side rendering in the browser, and then also React Native, sharing a lot of code there that we've talked about. But, excuse me, wanted to kind of diverge from the React world tonight and kind of focus on cool. Just want to make sure it's not blocking it. Wanted to focus on, as a front-end developer, how does the network work? How does the internet work in regard to my job, my day-to-day debugging, thinking about how data flows? So that's what this talk's about. Kind of this full story. How does someone open up the browser, type in a web address, and see a page? So behind the scenes, the browser goes through about four steps. It's going to look up who it's going to talk to, make a connection with that server, send the request, and get the response back. So diving in, we're Craftsy, so all the examples are Craftsy. So user types in Craftsy on their address bar, hits enter, and we're already world of magic. A lot of assumptions are going to be made about the state of the user's machine. First assumption, they have an internet connection. Pretty important when you're connected to the internet. When we think about if I'm on my phone, I might have a Wi-Fi connection. I might be 4G, 3G, LTE, some connection, and that signal is already going over a protocol. It's already talking with my Wi-Fi router. Might be plugged in with Ethernet. You're talking with a cell tower, something like that. To just hand wave that away would piss off a lot of network and hardware engineers. But we're front-end engineers largely here, so hand wave that away. So what happens from the browser side of things, type in an address, and the browser needs to know where to go. Essentially, this would be the same as me walking up to anyone in here with an envelope saying, hey, give this to Mark. You might know a Mark. If you know me, you know have some context of which Mark, but like, who is Mark? Where does he live? So the first step is resolving the domain name to a IP address that can be connected to and found. So the first step is connecting to a domain name server with that craftsy.com, asking what is the IP address that lives. This goes through multiple caches, multiple layers. It starts with your browser's cache. The browser, as you use it, builds up a cache of these DNS records. If it misses there, it'll go to your operating system, which will have a cache. If it misses there, it'll go to your network gateway, which could be your home Wi-Fi router, work, whatever, right? It's how your computer interacts with the rest of the network. It'll hit there. It might have cache, it might not, it might find the record that we're looking for. This is also where, especially if you're Office VPNs, things like that, if you have in-office, like company-only web addresses, internal intranets, things like that, your network has its own DNS server that knows how to respond as your computer talks to it, internal to that network, and tells it, hey, this domain that's only internally accessible lives over here on this IP address. So it goes up to the gateway, may or may not have the entry, goes up to the internet service providers, we're now at Comcast, and asks there, and just keeps going up and up and up. And because of that, that first DNS lookup can add a lot of slowdown as you're adding more connections. So it's kind of a back and forth as we think about resources on the internet. And a couple years ago, it was really big, like, hey, you should have 10 CDNs, right? Because the browsers limit the number of connections per domain, like 4 or 6 or 10, depending on the year in the browser. And so to make them make more requests all at once, why not have 10 CDNs and just requests from all of them? And we'll have more active connections. You can have up to 60 connections. Well, you're doing 10 DNS lookups on the front. So it's kind of a trade-off in just having that awareness. 10 CDNs, unless you're like Facebook and Google, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But a CDN is great for offloading assets. So we've found a domain name server somewhere in the stack. We can connect to it and ask, where is Crassi? And it'll come back and say, not found. But in our case, we round robin between 4 IP addresses of our CDN level, and just returns that list. This is our www record. So DNS records, there's different types. We'll get into really all of them. You can wiki it, it's confusing. But there's also ones where, like, if you're sending email to somebody at crassi.com, actually looks up a different NX, a mail record, and finds a different server to talk to, et cetera. So once we have an IP address, we now know where Mark lives. We can go find him. And so we open up a connection to that server. Only, not really. That server might be in Virginia, might be in Australia. It's not on your network, probably. So again, the first hop is to your local gateway, router, Ethernet, whatever. And you basically ask it, hey, I want to connect to this IP address. Somehow make that happen, make it work. Your router says, I don't know where that is, 151, who knows? It goes to your Comcast, something like that, your ISP. It says, can you route for this 151? It says, no, but I know one more layer up, the internet, bigger than Comcast. Yes, some router somewhere knows how to find 151, knows which continent it's on, right? Which block. It says, I'll take that, and starts routing it to other networks that it's aware of, knows that lives inside that 151 block, and says, I don't know where this 101 is, but you're 151, I know you know how to talk to it. And so it opens up this connection all the way through. And as you're browsing the internet, as you're doing anything, right, your computer's constantly sending these small data packets that's doing this traversal constantly. You can't get around it. Once you've found the server where it lives, you can't talk straight to it, right? You don't have a cord from your computer to the Amazon servers in Virginia. So every single thing you send has to traverse all these servers. Some interesting protocols and algorithms, obviously, to find optimal paths. 7 years ago, China, one of China's ISPs, essentially, published, accident or on purpose, no one really knows, a bad configuration and started taking about 15% of the world's internet traffic, including like .mil and .gov traffic. So it's a web of trust. The internet's based on, you say you can route 151.101, I'm going to trust you, and I know who you are. I'm connected to you, so it's a direct connection. It's probably the fastest. Here you go. The other thing here is all the data that you send through here, it's accessible and readable by these servers, right? They have to know the data you're sending and where it's going to. So it knows who you are, knows where the data is going, and if it's not encrypted, everything in this whole traversal network stack can read your data. So really big on, or really important why we have HTTPS and that whole handshake and everything. If you type your credit card number into a page that's not secured, doesn't have HTTPS, anyone that your data traverses can just read it. But it's easier to think about it this way. It's good to know those underlying things are there.
Magic.
But magic, yes. The other thing here is really we have to connect on a port. So HTTP default port is 80. Ports allow different processes on your computer to be talking simultaneously across the network. What happens is your computer basically selects a random port that's already open. It's a number that's unassigned. That's all that means. And it says, I want to talk to the server on this port. It goes over, makes all those hops, but not really. It talks straight to the server. And it says, I have a connection on port 80. Your server says, great, I have something to listen on 80. And now you're connected. So all this happens through a TCP handshake that kind of starts off and looks like this. TCP is a communication protocol because really your computer is just sending packets, right? And there's no real promise at that level that it's even leaving your computer, that it's leaving your ISP, that it's finding the right server. So TCP introduces a lot of guarantees. You have a socket that you can either be connecting on, you have a connection where it's closed, and there's a guarantee that the order that you send the information is the order that the server is going to receive it. So it starts off, the first three packets that get sent, your computer sends a synchronization, the SYN packet. It says, I'm going to start counting at 1. So if you see 1, 2, 3, that's the order that you need to parse these packets in. Server sends back its own. I'm going to start counting at 10, 11, 12, and I've acknowledged your synchronization. Your computer acts that, says I acknowledge, and then starts sending data. And this data is not just, so if I type a 1,000-word message in email, hit send, the computer's going to break that message up into smaller packed chunks. What the sizes are is kind of dependent on your operating system, but they're generally 1,000 bytes, unless someone wants to correct me. Roughly a few, maybe a couple kilobytes. And so it just breaks those messages up, numbers them 1, 2, 3, and sends them on their way. The server gets them, reorders them, and processes that application. Like I said, all those messages unsecured, anyone can read it. So early on, introduced SSL, or Secure Socket Layer, with HTTPS, and really opened up the, there's two problems that had to be solved. There's the one, great, my message found Mark, or a guy that says he's Mark. It might be Chinese Mark. Ignore that. It's terrible. The second problem is anyone along the way could have seen my messages, could have taken my credit card information. So I might not be giving my credit card to the right person, and someone else may have been able to read it as well. So to solve that, first you establish a TCP connection with the server on HTTPS. The server sends back its certification. It says, this is a public key you can use to talk to me with, and here's my credentials that verify who I am. Well, okay, so you have a piece of paper you printed out that says, hi, I'm Mark. I need to verify this still. So the concept of a certificate authority, your computer at an operating system level knows some IP addresses that it trusts and will take that certificate to and ask, is this Mark? I got this piece of paper from him. Is this the right number for him? And it can come back and say, no. In that case, the browser is just turned red, have that scary dialogue. They have to click a few links and say, no, I really trust this. Local dev servers, things like that. Or it's all good, and you get a nice green lock up in the URL bar. Everything's safe and secure. So the browser now knows, I'm going to trust it. I'm going to come up with a specific key that just the server and I know about, and we'll use that to encrypt and decrypt our messages as we communicate. All right, now we can actually send information securely. So what does that look like? If you open up Chrome DevTools and look at any of the requests coming through that panel, the network pane, you see things like this. So the request starts off for HTTP of, I'm going to get this path, right? Crashly.com/, something, /quilting, /whatever. I want this resource, and I'm going to talk to you in HTTP 1.1 language. By the way, if you didn't know who you are that I'm talking to, you're craftsy.com. Servers can have multiple, so the physical hardware of an IP address. The IP address that you're communicating to might map to multiple domains. And so this is a way of saying, I'm on craftsy.com /something. Connection, keep alive. That hard work that we just put into opening the TCP connection, finding the right path, establishing a secure connection, keep that around. Don't close that. We might do that later. What browser am I using? They get really long. I didn't have the room for it. What I'm looking for is a text or HTML document. If you have it, use it the content, so it's smaller. It's been compressed. Send it in that format. Cookies get sent here. So there's a whole host of these headers that can be sent in the request to the server. These are, I think you'd be pretty hard-pressed to find an example that didn't contain all of these, unless you didn't have any cookies for that server. So these get sent on their way with other things I can specify, like, hey, I prefer French if you have it, or different currencies, things like that. And then the server processes that request. And in this case, thankfully it found it, then 404, then 500 or anything. So it's going to come back and say, yep, I speak HTTP 1.1. I found the resource. Everything's OK. I agree. Let's keep that open. Hey, I can compress content for you, so it's smaller going over the wire. Should be faster. It's going to be text HTML, UTF-8 encoding. So as you parse the bytes that are coming across, we can format into Unicode characters, things like that. And then comes back with the extra response. And as the browser receives the HTML coming back, or CSS, whatever, it can start pre-processing that data, even before it has the full response. So in the case of Craftsy, in our head, we have the title. Great, browser can throw the title in the URL, in the application bar. And it found our CSS file. It may have only gotten this response from the server and nothing else yet, right? We're streaming packets through, they're traversing the internet. But the browser's gotten here, it can open up another connection and start asking for the CSS file before it has anything else. So browsers try to prioritize that content, CSS files as they find it, JavaScript files that aren't async, and then like images, if there's nothing else on the queue, we can start downloading as they find the URLs in the response. And that, to us, bubbles up into the Chrome DevTools or Firefox, whatever your preferred browser is. And as a live example, if you're ever in here and wondering what these waterfall colors are over here, it breaks down all of that TCP socket information into a nice visual chart of, because it happened, we queued the connection for not even a millisecond. DNS lookup, I didn't have it cached, so we had to go to the server and ask. It took 18 milliseconds. That initial connection, TCP handshake, and starting everything took 65. Starting up the SSL for security took another 40 milliseconds. Kind of breaks it up. And then, if I don't have cache disabled, and refresh. You can see it didn't go through any of those processes, those steps. It already had some connections open. It knew the DNS, where to look, and all of that information. It simply made the request, sent it. We waited that TTFB is time to first byte rather. So that's how long it took for the server to send back a response. And then it took another 6 milliseconds to download the whole thing. Fast internet's really nice. CDNs are really nice. So this took 13, not even 13 milliseconds to have all the HTML content for this page. And then it continues to break that down. We started downloading the CSS file right away because we had it in some of the main JavaScript files as well. Thankfully, looks like really fast cache times as well. And then moving on from there, so that's low-level-ish, low-level TCP networking, how your computer makes connections and talks to different servers. Then Moving on to a little bit higher level, and the other side of the coin, and what really, personally, is very annoying about web development, cross-origin resource sharing, or CORS. There was this problem where your browser could hit a site, and the site would make requests to banks, say. And those could come back and say, Wells Fargo would 404, but your bank would return a 200. Right? You're logged in, so the server knew how to actually process that information. So now, the site that you're accessing can run this JavaScript and report back, hey, this guy uses Wells Fargo, or whatever. It doesn't have to be a bank, right? It could be email accounts, things like that. And so the browser vendors got together and came up with CORS, which is a useful but annoying way of securing website data from other websites. So if I'm on craftsy.com and I make a request to craftsy.com/API/user, I get a 200 back. But if I were to have a different domain and connect to api.craftsy.com, the server would come back with, yes, before I get to what it comes back with, notice the get on the top, but then the second one, second request there is options. So before the browser even asks for the content, it says, hey, I want to get this resource. It asks, what are my options? Am I allowed for this site coming from Craftsy, am I allowed to ask you to get this resource? Am I allowed to post on this resource? In this case, the server said no, and the browser will, if you have DevTools open, just a stream of red with some cryptic error messages. Good luck. So this boils down to the same origin policy, or cross-origin, right? So this origin is composed of 3 parts. The scheme, so HTTPS versus HTTP, FTP, whatever. The host, craftsy.com, and the port, which is included here, right? It's assumed to be 443 instead of 80 earlier. 443 is SSL, and 80 is if you're just on normal HTTP, generally. So that creates the origin that gets sent across. So that options request here should look pretty similar to the get that we saw earlier. A couple things modified. It's sending the origin across. It's asking, hey, can I get this thing? And also, I'm going to be asking for content type headers back. And the server could respond with a whole host of things, right? 200, 500, 404, whatever it wants to. As long as a 2XX response comes back and says, yes, this origin is good, and I agree, here you can do get, you can even do post, and here we agree with the content type header as well, then your JavaScript, right, has access to make those requests for the additional content, make those AJAX requests. And it actually ends up looking like this. Sends the options, server has to come back with that 200, or 2XX has to be accepted, and then the browser can turn around and make the actual request. That's networking. Any questions? Thank you. Yes?
You know if HTTP2 is going to work a lot like that, or is there some version of it?
Yeah. So all of the TCP connection is the same, right? That's the basic protocol for synchronizing new communications across networks. And then I don't remember at the SSL, like the security level. I believe it's the same there. Certificate authority and all that definitely is, but the order might be a little bit different. And then instead of just asking or sending one request and saying, hey, I'm going to get/user or anything like that, it breaks it up into different chunks on the same connection. So at the same time, I could ask for 3 different resources on the same connection. And just the browser ends up numbering those, basically. Like, hey, my first request is this, my second one is this. And then the server can say, okay, I'm going to respond to your first one, I'm going to respond to your second request, and you're also going to need these other things. So instead of this purely text-based get and response, it breaks it into more, it's much harder to read. It starts getting into like binary communication channel for that multiplexing and two-way communication. Yeah?
When does that take effect?
Today, if you have a site that uses it, which you don't. So these examples had the HTTP 1/1. That's HTTP 2, which came out of Google's Speedy project, SPDY. And so if your browser supports it, they can ask the server, do you support it? And they can upgrade. So it'll start with like a normal connection. So yeah, it goes through the same channels there. Then it asks, do you support 2? If it does, it can start that multiplexed communication. Otherwise, it sticks with the 1.1. And most servers don't. Especially for front-end developers, we're using JavaScript. Basically, none of the JavaScript node frameworks for servers support HTTP 2. Some of them are starting to. We barely have that support in the browsers. Most of the CDNs, like CloudFront, Akamai, things like that, are just starting to add support. So there hasn't been enough benefit to really cross that threshold until now-ish. Definitely check it out. But it really, so if we're used to Webpack, I'm going to come into your site and ask for a bundle file, and I get it. The HTTP 2 version of that is you wouldn't Webpack it necessarily, or maybe smaller chunks, things like that. And your server would know, oh, you're on the user page. Oh, you asked for the user page, right? I'm going to send you these other resources that you're going to need. And so you're going to need to know the user data model. So here's a JavaScript file. You're going to need to know everything for the user page. So here we can send you separate files and break it down at that level. And because we're not making multiple requests and waiting for that back and forth, the server can just start sending all the data that's needed. So lots of paradigms change. Lots of frameworks and network things have to support it. And we're starting to get to the point where those discussions are happening to start figuring that out. Yeah.
It's a kind of follow-up question on that. Is that something the developer is going to be divvying up the project to say, like, this model, this resource, and that type of thing? Or is that going to be magic under the hood, and somehow that's going to be happening?
We will find out. I would hate to have to manually do anything like that. There's talk of, if I have this code base, I have a kind of like a Webpack config that tells it how it can be assembled together. Is there machine learning that can understand this page was asked for, and I saw that these things were needed. So in the future, when that page is asked for, I can just send those on its way. Magic, yes. Ideally, that is how it'll work. But you get weird things with CDNs. If you have your site that's fronted by a CDN and caching the content, maybe that cache content's missing half of what that user actually needs. So we have to rethink whole pipelines for that data access. Magic. Yes?
Other than like 404, what are the most common errors or bugs that you see that end up pointing to network errors?
Network errors usually end up as red, just things in the dev console. So especially if lose network, Chrome will just give the Ajax failed, the network _ error _ something, So very cryptic codes that are defined by one of the W3 specs with no additional information. So trial and error. Yeah. Yep. Move, turn your Wi-Fi off, turn it back on, and see if it fixes. Cool. Oh yeah.
I find 03 is almost like a network error. It's like basically that's the one where you get a gateway, it'll say a bad gateway. And it basically means that your application server isn't running, but your machine level thing is running. I don't know if that's considered. Sometimes those two processes are on different parts of the network. So that's fine.
Yep. Absolutely.
Do you know if, when you do a Google search, if Google goes out and gets those IP addresses for the results that are coming back, does it speed up? Or would you, when you click on that page, would you then have to go and find the IP for that?
So a couple ways that could be addressed that are. So there's, in addition to the HTML specs, includes, expands on the link tag. So we have link for style sheets. You can also add a link of prefetch. And there's also DNS prefetch. So you as a developer can say, it's very likely that the user is going to need this information. So you kind of hint to the browser if you're going to need this resource, and you can start queuing those up. There's also a preload, which tells the browser it's very likely, we think at least, that the user's going to go over here. Go ahead and make a request and like render it already, and just wait for them to click and need it. So those are hints that we could, as developers, give the browser and let it communicate with and kind of predict. The browser, like, would Chrome, the Chrome engineering team, would they go to their like Google? They're all Google. The Google search engine counterparts, like, can you hint to us what's the likelihood that the first link is clicked? Like, maybe. Browser wars are still a thing, and market share is big. And if your browser can load a Google result faster, that's better for you, maybe. Magic? All right, thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Chandler. We're going to take a quick 5 to 10 minute break. If people want to hit the restrooms, finish off whatever pizza's left here, grab another drink. So you back here, 5 to 10 minutes. Thanks. Nice.
Hi, Dieter. So we're going to yeah, go for it. I know, that's what I'm going to do, man. So many people come after the doors close. I'm sure it's something we can do. Other than like finding a random location that's open a little bit, turn on it, actually be able to see how it has this is like a lot of time.
I realized I kind of left you up there and didn't have anybody come and grab it.
It's like 30 people.
and I really love it. I moved from Boston, and I'm already, yeah, I'm cheering for Boston or Colorado. But guys are, I'm learning a lot about the city. Like I learned that adults can be drunk at 9 in the morning, like excessively drunk. I saw 3 adults in costumes, just running around in costumes in a park this Saturday, and I asked them what they were doing. Like, well, there's free breakfast burritos at Illegal Pete's. I was like, oh, that's why you're in costume. Like, no, this is because it's October. So, I'm trying to learn your ways, but it would be a little slow at first. So this whole talk is on a project I did called Offline Only, and it's going to be, I would call it like a horizontal talk. So it won't dive deep into any specific technologies, but I'll try to hit on a couple different things. If you're looking for the technical rigor of Chandler's talk, I'm so sorry to disappoint you. But we'll touch on some things. I hope that if you're a senior engineer, you could learn something, and if you're just starting out or you're a student, you could learn something as well. So we'll talk a little bit about the browser's offline API. We'll talk about service workers, and some of these relate pretty closely to Chandler's talk. We'll talk about open sourcing some of your work, whether it's a library or a website. We'll talk about different ways you can promote your project online, especially in social media. And then preparing for the best, like let's say people actually like the thing you made and you get a lot of attention, and preparing for the worst, like trolls and people that have nothing better to do but insult you. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about internationalization or localization. So I think it's a pretty interesting topic that we don't hit on a lot. But first I'll show you what the heck I'm talking about. So this is a project I made. Pretty simple page, just tells us to disconnect. So if we go here, disconnect from the Wi-Fi, we'll see the contents of the page. And I won't read you this. If you're curious, you can read that. I thought it would be kind of fun to play with people's expectations, like what the internet is like, and what if a part of the internet forced you to disconnect from the rest of the internet. But there's a couple things I want to show you about that page. The first is that it is localized, so it's in a couple different languages. So we can switch that. We can go offline again, and I think that this is something that freaks people out. We can refresh this page, and it works just fine. In fact, we could open up a new tab, and it would work just fine. But that's a little bit unlike any other page, like Google is not available. So we're using a little bit of magic to make this page available offline. There's so many times I've tried to do something on my computer and I didn't know why it didn't work. It's because I was offline testing my page. It's like, I don't know what's wrong with Google Hangouts. It must be your connection. So to do that detection, we're actually using a very widely accepted browser API that I haven't seen people use a whole lot. It's the offline API, and it's available right on Navigator, navigator.online. And this will tell us the state of the connection of the current device. And the implementation is very wildly, but usually this means, do we expect to be able to make a successful connection? And so, are you on a network? And is that network connected to the internet? So these are a couple layers that Chandler was addressing. It doesn't mean that I can successfully contact any site I would like to. And unfortunately, there's a lot of idiosyncrasies. In fact, Chrome on Windows, so a very popular browser, this appears to not work at all. So you will hit a few of those things, but welcome to the web. There are online and offline events that you can subscribe to with Add Event Listener, and you can just listen for an online event when the user comes online, or an offline event when the opposite occurs. And again, these are pretty widely supported, but make sure you test it. Service workers are another aspect of this project, and that's where you really get some of the magic. And so these are background scripts. Has anyone heard of service workers? Show of hands. So like, I would say over half. And so I won't belabor the point, and you're probably more of an expert than I. But they're basically separate from your web page, and they get privileges to do things that your web page can't. And in this case, they can be a proxy in between the browser and the network itself. In fact, it kind of is if we looked at Chandler's chart and we drew a line right at the very beginning and said, right when you type, in this case, bolin.chris/offline, we're going to see if there's a service worker and if that service worker would like to intercept that request. And if it would like to intercept that request, it could do whatever it likes. And in fact, this case is just returning a cached copy. And so that's why my page can be available offline, but Google, for example, chose not to do that. I think there's a very good reason they chose not to do that, because Google would be useless without the rest of the network. But there are some pretty cool projects that use this. There's one called DevDocs. And so if you'd like to look at your documentation while you're offline, you can use this page to cache that. So I use that on planes and some things like that. One of the coolest projects that I use in the React world is called Create React App. People are probably familiar with that. So that gives you service workers for free. And so I know more about service workers because I have to give this talk, not because I used them. So they give you that for free, and you can just go off and make something and take advantage of that technology. So it's pretty cool, and I'd highly recommend that. So after you have a project that you like and want to share with people, one of the things I would really recommend you do is open source it. Even if you don't think it's, millions of people are going to use your specific library, I think it's a sign of good faith to tell the community, hey, I'd like to show you what I did, but also you can peek behind the curtain and see how it's built. This is a community of tinkerers, so people are going to want to see how you did what you did, and it's a lot easier to answer questions if you can just point to the source. In fact, it can get pretty annoying if people are constantly asking you how you did this. You can just have them read it for themselves. And if you do hit upon something that you think is general purpose and reusable, you can make a library. And I'll show you the library I made for this that's React specific. I ended up open sourcing the library and the website itself. And you can get into the details of what open source means, but let's just use it as in it's free and you can see the source. And with any open source library, I think the best strategy is to go with something you need at first, something very simple, and then if it does get adoption, if people do start using it, you can start getting after some of those edge cases that are harder to cover when it's a simple library. So here is my simple library. It's called React Detect Offline. And all this will basically do, you can look at the syntax here. This is the only code you'll see this whole time, so enjoy it. or we'll get through quickly. And so you import two components here, online and offline, and essentially when you render those, only one of them will be rendered. If you're online, you'll render the stop bit. If you're offline, vice versa. And one of the big advantages of React is that everything is declarative, or should ideally be declarative. And by that, I mean we don't have a lot of setup steps, right? We're not saying subscribe to these events, do these things when these events happen. All of that's taken care of. All of that ugliness is hidden from the user, and they should be able to have a declarative API. These things can get more complex, of course, but this is the simplest case scenario and ideal, I think, in the React world. All right, so after you have your open source project or something available on the web and you want to promote it, what should you do? Honestly, I think the biggest piece of advice I would give someone is try to find someone more popular than you and see if they will share it, right? And so I did exactly that. I tried to find somebody with a couple thousand Twitter followers and get them to repost it and see what happens. You could also tag the technologies you use. So React is pretty popular, but if you use something that's a little bit more niche, people might be really interested in seeing that out in the wild. Look what I made with this specific tech. In fact, you might even talk to some of the maintainers of that project, and they might get really excited about it. So that's another avenue to go down. And then I would say, just engage with people. People are in general pretty friendly, and they're usually pretty engaged in what they're doing. And so if you find someone whose work is related to yours, or they've done something you've enjoyed, try to engage with them and say, hey, what do you think of this? Or I liked what you did, and I'm riffing on it here. But make sure you understand the specific social media platforms. So, for example, I don't use Hacker News at all, but my site made it to Hacker News. And so I thought, okay, I should go on Hacker News and see what's going on. And people said some really sweet things, and so I was like responding, I was like, oh, cool, thanks. And then I realized that the platform itself disincentivizes you from sending too many messages. And so every time you send a message, you basically lose like 1 health point, like one of your reputation points. And so I just like looked up and I was like, why am I -10? How did this happen? And it wouldn't even let me post anymore. It just said slow down. I was like, oh, okay, I'm misunderstanding something. And then someone had to explain to me like, oh, this is how Hacker News works. So just make sure you understand, especially the explicit conventions of a community, but also the implicit conventions as well. And then honestly, and this is pretty obvious, but press will get you the most attention. And so if a tech journalist reaches out to you, and you would like to get this a wider audience, engage with them, see if they're willing to do an interview and talk with them. That's like when this specific project, and I'll show you the graph of like page views, like when it really spikes is when a couple journalists started writing about it. Because there's only so many people that like know my friend on Twitter, right? There's only so far that thing will grow from there. And then a final piece of advice is to use the Open Graph tag. So, is anyone familiar with Open Graph? All right, I can teach you something now. So Open Graph is how social media platforms and other sites do previews of links. And so this is a screenshot from Twitter, right? So this is this guy's tweet, and he just included a link to my site. And as opposed to showing the raw text of the URL, it's going to replace that with a preview here. And there's a couple elements to the preview. It has a title, it has a description, shows the domain, and it has a little preview here. And these are all meta tags in your HTML. You can see the basic format right here. Just a property and content key value pairs there. And then here's a couple of the examples. So for the description, you can see it there. They have the URL and the image. And those are what powers things like Twitter and Facebook, but also Slack. I don't know if you've seen the previews on Slack. Spotify has a really impressive embed that basically lets you stop and play a song right from there. And those are riffing on the same concept here. Even Gmail will now do previews like this. So if you're doing something you think someone might share, it's a good idea to take the extra 10 minutes and put these tags in your HTML. I have a few specific pieces of advice for Twitter. It's the platform I use the most. I would say use TweetDeck. It's a company that's actually acquired by Twitter. It's run by Twitter now, but it allows you to subscribe to very specific pieces of news. So you can look for if your URL was shared. You can engage with people that way. It gets rid of a lot of the noise. You can just ignore your Twitter timeline and all of that, and you can be pretty target focused on this one thing. Yeah, I would definitely recommend that you search for your URL. You can do that in Twitter itself or on TweetDeck. And even if someone uses like a bit.ly or one of these URL shorteners, it'll still show you that in your search results. So even if it doesn't say your site, it's still a way to find it. And that's pretty fun because a lot of people aren't going to bother to find out who you are and what your handle is on Twitter or something. But you might find somebody that you really respect or that their work is interesting, shared your link, and you can reach out to them. And the last bit is I think Twitter is probably the most informal of all these platforms. And so reach out to people. They're pretty nice. They're pretty chill. The worst they're going to do is just ignore you. And so, sorry?
They can also troll you.
Yeah, they can, indeed. Oh, we'll get there. And so if things actually go well, if you make something that happens to be interesting, if you get really lucky, if your popular friend is even more popular than you thought, and people start liking this, maybe it'll take off for a second. So this is users on my page before. It was basically an average of 0 a day, right? Like no one comes to my page. And then all of a sudden, like this is probably some small publications and some big ones, and now there's like 3,000 people a day, right? And it dies off. This is like what a viral moment would look like, and it dies off, and now it's like 80 people a day or something like that, as opposed to 0. But you should be prepared for that if that is your goal, if you would like people to view this thing. Or you should be prepared for that if you want it to even work, because you could structure in a way in which it would break if 3,000 people arrived at the same time. So Chandler talked about CDNs, but CDNs are very important, especially in the front-end web. CDN stands for a Content Delivery Network, and that's basically servers that you can find around the world, and you give them your content. You say, here's my repository, or here's my website, and they will replicate that across the world. So when someone in Turkey wants to look at your site, it gets there really fast. And you don't have to deal with that delay. And that usually is no work and usually no money for you. I use Cloudflare, and their free tier is fine for anything I would do. Also think about using HTTPS or SSL. That's going to help you in a couple of different respects. First of all, I think people are a little less leery of going to secure sites. And also, Google will uprate your result in the search results if you have a secure connection. And then the last thing that I didn't have to worry about, but you should think about, is think about scaling your databases and servers, right? So this is a completely front-end project, so I don't need to worry about any of this because the CDNs are my server. But if you if you're running some node servers, or you need to think about what happens if 3,000 people come knocking at the same time. You need to think about what happens if you get all of these database requests. And there's really nice services for all this, but usually you have to pay for this stuff. So think a little bit about that. And of course, you do have to maybe brace for the worst. So if, let's just read this, right? So this is on Reddit. And this is what someone sent me. And this is like, I think this is the best one. This is my favorite, but then this shit happens. So trolls are real. I don't quite understand their motivation, but they're out there, swinging elections and mocking your art. And so just be ready for that. They're going to berate what you do. They're going to try to break it. And there's a couple different strategies, and really you just have to pick like whatever works for you personally. And for me, it really depends on my mood. Like sometimes I'm like, this guy, I gotta walk away. This is too much right now. And sometimes you can engage with them. I think the best way to deal with this stuff is to laugh at it, laugh with them, right? Treat them as if they're a joke. Like, oh man, that's really hilarious what you said. And they're going to get pissed because that's not at all what they wanted. They want to get a rise out of it. But also don't be afraid to just walk away, mute it, don't even look at that page anymore. And I think the network, like my theory is that the different communities that have sprung up on the web deal with this very differently. And so I think if people are sharing your work on Twitter, Facebook, even LinkedIn, I didn't even realize people use LinkedIn like that, but they do. I think I got tagged on LinkedIn. I didn't know that was even possible. Usually people are pretty supportive because they're posting it and they're like, hey, here's something interesting I found. Check it out. And especially if it's LinkedIn, everyone's very professional and they're like, oh, this is neat too, I'll share it. And most people aren't going to bother with posting and saying like, I hate this. Look, here are the 10 ways this is bad. But for some reason, in some of the subreddits, like the programming subreddit or Hacker News, it's exactly what people want to do, is they just want to rip it apart. So if your stuff gets on Hacker News, just like, I don't know, like find a friend and walk through Hacker News together, and if it gets rough, just get out. I gotta tell you, this is an example of how people will break things. So when this offline project took off, I had a small indie game with a scoreboard, and this is what the leaderboard is supposed to look like, right? And I come in, and of course, some genius. Like, someone wasted an hour of their day messing up my indie game, right? So I don't want to scare you from sharing your project, but just like be ready for this stuff and try to laugh it off. And it's annoying because I had to spend another hour like building the right database rules to protect from somebody doing this, resetting the data. This is what happens. I'm glad you're laughing at it because I didn't at first. So the last piece I want to talk about is internationalization. So I showed you on the page that it's available, and I think there's 8 translations plus the original English, and I know no other languages. I can order a beer or 2 beers or 3 beers in Spanish. Por favor. And that's about it. I'm a monolinguist. But people, well, this is weird. I didn't realize it, but they will volunteer to translate your work. In fact, sometimes they'll just ask you permission after they did it, or not even ask for permission. How this started for me is this guy in France reached out to me on Twitter and was like, hey, I really liked what you did, so I cloned the repo, I translated it into French, I changed all of your colors, and I put it on my site. I was like, that is so sweet, but could I use your translation and you could take down that? But you can use whatever strategy you want. I would rather like consolidate this and understand, like try to control the concept. But he did this for free, right? And then I had a couple other French people reach out. I was like, oh, I don't like this part of the translation, or this could be better. I was like, this is great. We can work on this. I don't understand French at all, but bring it on. But keep in mind that translation is really hard, right? This is one of the fundamental concepts in the global economy is how do you translate an idea? How do you translate trust? And so someone has to be very familiar with both languages to do that well. And so if someone volunteers to translate your work, they're probably not going to do a great job. Not because they didn't want to, or not because they're not great people, not because they're not more fluent in more languages than I am, but because it's hard. And so be ready for people to say, oh, this is a little bit weird. In fact, I got a little bit of press in French, and I translated the article, and one of the French cognates I saw was maladroit. And they basically said that the French translation is very clumsy. I was like, oh. And so I reached out to the journalist. I was like, well, could you help me make it less clumsy? They didn't respond. But just be ready for that kind of stuff. So I chose to take on people if they shared it in their language and they're really interested. I was like, well, do you want to translate it into your own? And I think people enjoy this, right? Then they can share it with their friends, and they don't only have to share it with their friends who know English really well. Just remember that proofreading is also hard, and so people will get back to you with revisions, which is really annoying in a language you don't speak, because someone's like, oh, please take this word and replace it with this. And if the first word is in Russian, and they use like like Romanized Russian, it's really hard to find that in your text. So be ready for these things. It can be a little annoying. And then small features really help with translation. So on my site, if your browser is set to Arabic, it will load the Arabic page. And the other thing I tried to do is when you change translations, it'll change the URL. It'll add a little bit, search there, a little query. And so when they share it with their friends on Twitter, assuming they shared the Arabic translation, someone will be able to view the Arabic translation. But just keep in mind that multi-language code can be pretty complex. There are some solutions for this, even in React, but I would say they're enterprise grade, and sometimes you don't want to go through the work of using an enterprise grade tool. So just keep in mind, like, this is basically a giant switch statement, and you have to have like all of these different languages, and you have to place those wherever you use text. But I would say overall it's a positive because you can reach a whole new audience. Like people, in fact, when I look through Twitter now, more people are sharing this in languages other than English than in English, which makes sense on a global perspective. Of course, English is not the lion's share of the world's languages, but I don't speak any of those languages, and I barely look at media from any other language. So it's pretty awesome if you see this going around. I'll give you a couple hints on editing foreign text if you do decide to do this. Pretty niche, but just be very aware of autocorrect. You're going to keep your computer in English most likely, but autocorrect is going to want to change things. Like I posted the Persian or the Turkish translation, and it had the word sister in it, the English word sister, because when I pasted it, autocorrect changed some word that's like sister to the English word sister. So what I do is translate back and forth. Google Translate's actually very, very good. You place their translation in Google Translate, read it through in English. It should sound like a robot translated it, but it shouldn't have anything weird like, sister as opposed to offline. And then the final thing is editing right-to-left text is very, very hard. And I don't know a good solution for this. So Arabic and Hebrew are right-to-left scripts. It is just very, very hard, even to select text, right? Like your whole brain gets screwed up, and then especially if it's in your code, the JSX elements are going to be treated as left to right, but this text is going to be treated as right to left. So be aware. And that sums it up. I'd like to give you a few of the takeaways that I found here. And I think the first is that I have even a deeper appreciation for the web. I think it's an awesome platform for experimentation. It's really a big playground. And I don't know if any of you develop native apps, like React Native or things like that. And I love native apps, that's awesome. But do you know how hard it is to get someone to download your app, right? And how easy it is to get them to visit a website? So you can literally reach 1,000 times more people with a web page than you could an app. And so if you have a little idea you want to get out there, maybe the web is a better place than a native app. I truly believe that, even though I've worked in both platforms. In the React-specific world, use Create React App. I think it's really handy. It takes care of a lot of the junk that you don't have to worry about. You even get service workers for free. The next is usually no one will care about your work. That's just the reality of it. Like I've made a lot of things that I thought were kind of cool, and people were like, yeah, whatever. Like, congrats. And that's okay, right? You should be doing this because you like it. I mean, I hope that's the reason you would spend time putting something on the web, is because you like it. But just in case people do start caring, there are a couple things that you could do to prepare yourself. So use Open Graph if you think this might be shared. Try to use SSL, which comes for free with things like Cloudflare, and then use CDNs, which you can also get with Cloudflare. Remember that trolls are real, they're out there, and just pick whatever strategy works for you in that moment. But it happens to everyone. And quite honestly, like it's really sad that I get it the least bad, right? I'm a dude, and I'm a white guy, and I get it least bad. So I'm so sorry for the rest of you that that might be even worse. But there's a lot of friendly people out there, right? So when you hit that ugly side of the internet, go find a friend. And lastly, internationalization is a really hard thing, but I would say overall it opens up a lot of doors. It could be pretty cool. And remember to have fun with the thing, because that's why we're doing this, right? It's a weird industry that most of us are in here because we like it. You can't say that for a lot of other professions. Thank you so much. You can get in touch on Twitter. Actually, through this project, I found out that one of my love languages is you following me on Twitter. There's an email address if you need to do that. If you want to find out more about what Formidable does, you can check that out. And I do have the slides here. You could write it down, or I'm sure we'll post it to the meetup page. Thank you all so much. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Have you ever thought of like the prayer, Google prayer, so just like how how do I like make an offline page or I don't know, something like that, or the
Oh.
Stack Overflow people like. So I've seen that a lot. Like people will be like, how do I do this? So we got the Redux thing, and someone's like, oh, yeah, I made a library, you know, for like protection or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
He made Redux, but like, I don't know if you thought about that. That's how some other stuff. So people all the problem now, like on a thread or something, and someone will like, oh, I made a library. And,
Yeah, yeah.
Or like they make a medium pose, like you type it in at the top of the list of the medium pose.
Yeah.
And it's Apollo, it's by all the Apollo, they just make their own, but
Yeah.
yeah.
And so I haven't gone on Stack Overflow at all, mainly because it's just kind of like a weird experiment. But I did do a blog post through Formidable, and I think that just to put a little bit of flesh behind that. I mean, it's basically this talk condensed into like a 4-minute read or something. But that's a really good point about Stack Overflow. Any other questions?
How did you track your users?
That's a really good question.
What site were you tracking? Were you tracking the GitHub repo, or were you tracking the site that demonstrates?
Yeah, so I use Google Analytics, and those stats were for Google Analytics period over my domain. But because of the nature of the experiment, you're told to go offline, and so usually Google Analytics won't even see your user, right? So most of those users actually left that page and went to my home page, which I loaded. So that's actually a hard question. I don't know exactly how to do something like that with this like goofy experiment where like the network will be cut off. Basically, after all incoming, you don't really have a lot of outgoing. But yeah, that's Google Analytics. It's for the whole domain, so I don't know. Some of those get caught. Sorry, question here, and I looked right over.
I was just curious, what was your game? What was the game that?
Oh, it's this horrible helicopter game. No, it's called Skycoins. This is from my very first user, my lovely wife, right here. I said, "This is shitty." And it's hard. Like you usually fall in the. Sorry, question over here somewhere.
Yeah. Are there any other interesting browser technologies you're looking at trying out in the future?
It's really interesting. So I kind of got into this backwards, where like I wanted to do the thing, and then I found the browser tech that would work for it. I think service workers are honestly a pretty cool idea, because it's basically like it's going to separate the idea of a web page and what you could do with a browser. And so I think there's a lot to be exploited there that I'm still learning. So if I like had a bunch of time to sit down and do something, it would probably be in service workers. Yeah.
Have you seen other people use similar online-offline functionality in their own work? And if so, how is it different from yours?
So the primary use of something like this is in, for example, Gmail. And Gmail will tell you that you're offline right now. And it's going to try to reconnect. And so usually I would say it's in maybe a pro-connection world, where like connection is valued and maybe even connection is necessary. That's the primary use of this. Like HubSpot has a pretty good library. I think it's called Offline, and it'll basically help you like put these little banners up and say, hey, you're offline right now, but we'll try to reconnect you, and so on. So I basically just tried to take that and just like dump it on its head and see what does it look like if it's backwards. And I haven't seen too many people try things like that. That's kind of why I was geeked out about it, because I don't know if that exists.
Seems like it also makes sense for books and blogs and things of that nature, where you'd be reading material that somebody's written that you don't need the connection to read it, you just need the connection to get it.
Yeah, stay tuned. I'm trying to make a magazine like this, so we'll see. See how annoyed people get with it. Yeah, that's all right.
Does your offline online component, do they work in IE? Do they work in Chrome on Windows?
It's kind of experimental right now. Like I'm trying to use polling, but I don't know. It's not great. But essentially, what I mean by that is like if this API doesn't work, just try to like request something regularly from the network, which is so sloppy. I really hate that, but I can't think of another way to do it. It works all right. I don't know. I don't love it. I don't know. It's Thanks. That's my boss. That's what he's going to do. Thanks for the softball. We agreed on this. Yeah, that's okay.
I was wondering if you had any other examples of why you would want to use offline behavior, like in a normal business-like application that had business logic.
Yeah. Well, to be strictly offline is kind of strange, right? And so I think that there are only human factors, right? Like limiting, a person's concentration is limited when they're online, so maybe you want to do that. Or maybe, maybe teachers would want to force you to be offline while students are taking an exam or even just studying for something. I think those are maybe some of the only business cases I could come up with. Yeah.
I'll address that. So I've been reading a lot about PWAs and a lot of the offline first movement. So some of the general cases would be for intermittent, like for traveling. So a lot of travelers, a lot of remote workers who have intermittent, or if they're traveling a lot, going through subways, that kind of thing. But then one of the examples that I liked the most was people who are developing, for example, medical types of software, say in rural areas in Africa, that they have not only intermittent internet connectivity, but also electricity. So they need to be able to take in meaningful data, be able to do something with it, and then be able to sync it up once everything is connected again, and keep on running, and not everything fall apart until they're back up and running again.
Yeah, that's a really good case. And keep in mind, these are events, right? So you could say, like, the second you're connected, try to sync this really important data that you've been hanging on to and exists nowhere else in the world.
I think Gmail, I think if you type, you don't have connection, it goes to local storage, and the second you get connection, syncs up.
I think Google Docs also works offline.
Oh, yeah, yeah. There's some cool examples of stuff that works offline now. Anything else? I'll just hang out. I mean, we can talk about this later too. All right. Cheers, y'all. Thanks.
Thank you.
Huge thanks to Chris and Chandler both. And just a couple things before you go. We wanted to, beyond the speakers, thank you all for showing up. Thanks to our sponsors, any volunteers we had, Richard, Nick, co-organizer here, Will. Appreciate everybody's work to make this come together here. So we are looking for speakers in December and beyond. So if you have a topic that you want to talk about, please find myself or Will, and I'm more than happy to help you brainstorm or strategize around that. So with that, I will let everybody disperse. Thanks again for coming, and have a great night.
I had a really quick thought. It's the same camera I've got. That camera stopped working on my computer. Yes, I bought one of these. Nice. Do you like it? I do. Yeah, it's really nice. People are really surprised when they video call.